I'm Amy Bass, professor of sports studies. I'm here today to answer your questions from the internet. This is Olympic History Support. Buckshot0331 wants to know, is the Olympics today the same Olympics that the ancient Greeks did? Absolutely not. The antiquity games basically focused on things like running and wrestling, some boxing, some jumping, where we have so many events in the modern games, over 200 countries. We have women competing, almost 11,000 athletes, and I think most importantly in the modern games, the athletes wear clothes. Alfbridge43 asks, what were the original ancient Greek Olympic sports? And the answer to that is simple. It was running. It was a sprint, one race to honor Zeus, game's over. TW Chanda asks, was Cool Runnings a true story? So Cool Runnings, of course, is the film made about the Jamaican bobsled team. And there is a Jamaican bobsled team. They're actually pretty good now. And I think that the Jamaican bobsled team sort of has that cultural hold on everybody because it is a classic fish out of water story. There's no snow in Jamaica. There's no bobsled runs in Jamaica, but they do have a running culture. And so that idea of fast runners pushing a bobsled became that kind of a dream. And thus we have Cool Runnings. Jazzlight Garage 2799 wants to know, who's the biggest underdog to win a gold medal? That, I think almost everyone will agree, took place in Salt Lake City in 2002 when Australian short track speed skater Stephen Bradbury won gold. He was so far behind the leaders, which was tons of Korean skaters, American Apollo Anton Ono, who was the headline of the Salt Lake Games. They had a massive pileup, which happens a lot in short track. It's basically roller derby on ice. Bradbury was so far behind the leaders that he was able to avoid and step over the carnage in front of him to skate across the finish line first. Everybody else had to crawl. Ralph Jenkins 2021 wants to know what Olympic sport is the hardest. I think there's two ways to look at it. There's the skill set sports, and then there's just this is a really hard sports. So decathlon, heptathlon, modern pentathlon, sports where you need to know how to do more than one thing and do it really, really well are very difficult sports. And sometimes it doesn't have to be a whole bunch of things. I think biathlon, a winter Olympic sport that combines Nordic skiing and shooting, is a terribly difficult sport. You can't dope for it because anything that you do to make yourself a faster skier is gonna hurt you as a shooter. You are racing, and then you have to lie down on your stomach and hit a target. It's very, very difficult. But I think then you can flip to the other side and say, just what is a grueling sport? And I think most people would agree that it's water polo. You can't touch the sides, you can't touch the bottom. You are treading water, you are creating power to score goals with a ball, you are knocking each other's teeth out. It is just an absolutely brutal sport. Hey, a Quora user asks, when were the first Olympic Games? So that question begs for two answers. The very first Olympic Games were 776 BC in Olympia, Greece. There was one event, a sprint race to honor Zeus. The Olympics we know, 1896, Athens launched the modern Olympic Games with about 14 countries competing in a handful of sports. Celtic Norseman 2 asks, what do the rings in the Olympic flag mean? So the 5 rings in the Olympic flag represent the 5 continents of the globe. And those colors, 5 colors of the rings on a white background, include a color from every flag in the world. Cody Taplin asks, how TF is breakdancing in the Olympics? Breakdancing came and went with the Paris Olympics in 2024. Australia's Ray Gunn making headlines for a less than gold medal performance. And that's part of what the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, does every once in a while to try to attract a younger audience. But it has worked in the past. If you look at sort of the X-gamification of the Winter Games with things like snowcross and halfpipe, we have seen a rise in those kinds of sort of younger skewed sport. It was to try to create the success of the urban vibe that skateboarding brought with its launch in Tokyo, but I don't think it was terribly successful. Zizbird asks, who is the Winter Olympics GOAT? There's two ways to look at that. You could do total accumulated medals. Marit Bjørgen, Norwegian cross-country skier, 15 total medals, most decorated in a single Olympic Games, 1980 Lake Placid, Eric Heiden for speed skating. Or you can look at what's still to come. We have GOATs in our midst right now. Michaela Schifrin as a slalom skier, the winningest World Cup skier in history. We have Chloe Kim looking to just continue to be unbeatable, snowboard halfpipe. So keep your eyes peeled. There's GOATs coming. Shadus X wants to know, what prompted the restart of the Olympics in the late 1800s? So the launch of the Olympics in 1896 was the brainchild of Baron Pierre de Coubertin, and he was a sport enthusiast who wanted to bring together the children of the world, understanding that sport was a unifying agent, physical fitness was important, and thus he wanted to relaunch it as a global event. Mr. K Wisconsin asks, whoever developed the modern pentathlon was definitely high when they did so. Not so much a question, more of a statement, but a pretty accurate one. Modern pentathlon was the brainchild also again of the modern Olympic founder, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, and he wanted to bring together a range of skills that personified what he thought a modern soldier needed to be able to do. It's varied over its history: fencing, equestrian, running, shooting, swimming. Sometimes it takes place over 3 days, sometimes it takes place in 1 day, sometimes they have time limits of 2 hours. And one of the keys to being successful at modern pentathlon, you have to be really good at all of those different things. Brisbane 2032 asks, when did the Olympics first award gold, silver, and bronze medals? And that's a great question because it did not happen at the first modern iteration of the Games. It was 1904 in St. Louis, where gold, silver, and bronze medals were awarded. The ancient Greeks did not do medals, they did wreaths. Spinnable Sports wants to know, what was the most memorable moment in Olympic history? Wow. This is a hard one because it depends on what you prioritize. Recently, Simone Biles in Paris throwing a Yurchenko double pike on the vault. First woman to ever land that in Olympic Games, something they couldn't even score. It was so difficult. Looking at Jesse Owens' 4 Olympic golds in Berlin in 1936, so-called Hitler's Games, having a Black American pull that feat off. But even with those two amazing things, I think most people would say 1980, Miracle on Ice, Lake Placid, US hockey team defeating the Soviets in the semifinal, and then going on to win gold against Finland. Lazy Condition Zero brings an excellent question. Who are some Olympic athletes who dominated their sport to the same or greater degree as Simone Biles dominates gymnastics, and Michael Phelps in his prime dominated his swimming events? One of the things about who dominates a sport and has the most medals in the Olympics is that some sports, like gymnastics and swimming, have a lot of events that one athlete competes in, so they accumulate a lot of medals. But I like to look at an athlete like Al Order, who won the discus in 4 consecutive Olympic Games, gold medal over the course of 16 years. So that's complete dominance, but he only gets 1 medal per Games, unlike Michael Phelps, who always brings home a haul of medals. For Winter Games, I would look at Norway's Marit Bjørgen, 15 medals in cross-country skiing, 8 of which are gold, the most successful Winter Olympian. But then you want to look at a single Games dominant sport, and for that I would go to Eric Heiden, 1980, Lake Placid, 5 gold medals in speed skating. He sweeps the sport. Big Red Bear 2 asks, what restrictions were there on visitors to the 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin hosted by Hitler? There were Black and Jewish athletes from the US and other countries. So Berlin in 36 is called by historians a facade of hospitality. The athletes who were competing, Jesse Owens being, of course, the standout athlete, they were almost propaganda tools. See, we're welcoming everybody. Look, there's a Black man on the field. They were not as hospitable to the visitors that were being welcomed into Berlin. So a lot of folks experienced discrimination and hostility upon setting foot as an Olympic spectator in Berlin. We have a Quora user asking, what is the oldest unbroken Olympic record as of today? And that one was set in 1968, Mexico City. American long jumper Bob Beamon is the first human to break 29 feet. Mike Powell did break that record for a world record in 1991, but no one has ever jumped further at an Olympic Games. It is good to put a little tiny asterisk next to that, because the Mexico City Olympic Games took place at altitude, and that literally enabled people to fly. Major Spiritual 1963 asks, what was the greatest opening and closing ceremony in Summer Winter Olympics? I think Summer Olympics almost always have the edge on this. Winter Olympic opening and closing often take place outside in winter, which limits a lot of what they can do, which isn't to say we haven't seen some spectacular. The opening ceremony in Vancouver, for example, was absolutely a beautiful tribute to Canadian heritage. I think in terms of spectacle, however, Beijing 2008 is going to win just for the absolutely unprecedented synchronicity that we saw, the tales that came out afterwards, performers under the stage for umpteen hours wearing diapers to keep them there. So once we learned how they did it, I think it became a little bit less glitz and glam. But when Beijing 2008 happened, it absolutely blew every other opening ceremony off the water. I would also say that we have poignant moments in opening and closing ceremonies, really beautiful moments. And for that, I'm gonna go to Atlanta, 1996, where we see Muhammad Ali take the torch from swimming legend Janet Evans, and Muhammad Ali lights the cauldron and stands before the world with the Olympic flame over his head. There was not a dry eye in the house. BKA004 asks, what's an unlikely sport that could now have a shot at being an Olympic event? Olympic events come and go. They can depend on the host country and the culture of that country. We see flash in the pan sports like breakdancing in Paris. We see new sports emerge, flag football in 2028, Los Angeles. That's not an accident. The NFL is very excited about the growth of flag football in the United States, particularly on the girls' side. And then you have new sports like Milan Cortina. We're gonna see ski mountaineering, where we're gonna be watching people running up a mountain with their skis and then skiing down it. So never say never pretty much for any sport. Kangaroo Key 2017 asks, what age were you when you realized that curling is the best sport in the world? I've always known that. We identify with curling because it looks like something we can all do. Those athletes look like us, which isn't to take anything away from their skill and athleticism. You have to remember that everything a curler is doing, they're doing on ice, and they're not falling down, and they're getting a relatively small object into a relatively small space over a relatively large expanse of ice. MCQ 101 wants to know, when were women first allowed to compete in the Olympics? Women launched their careers as Olympians in 1900 at the Second Olympics. There were 5 sports, the usual suspects for what's okay for a woman to do, things like tennis. We didn't see distance sports for women in the Olympics until much later. Actually, distance sports were banned for women starting in 1960 after a completely fabricated story about women passing out during the 800 meters ripped headlines. And we're not gonna see an Olympic marathon for women until LA 84. Women are now dominating a lot for the US team, but it has been a journey. Biz Bastard wants to know, why is Fosbury flop the most efficient way to do high jump? Well, when Dick Fosbury launched that flop very successfully, everyone thought it was kind of nuts. But really, it's a simple physics equation where Dick Fosbury was raising the center of his body and lowering the rest of it to create the arch over the bar. Before Dick Fosbury, high jumpers looked face forward at the jump. Fosbury turns the vertical into a horizontal, and that was a more efficient and better way to jump. Additional Sky 7436 asks, what historic Olympic team was the best basketball team? So I think the obvious answer here for almost everybody is the 1992 so-called Dream Team, the USA basketball team that was just stacked with NBA professionals. But I'm gonna counter that a little bit. Take a look at the women's side. From Atlanta to Paris, they're undefeated, gold medals across 10 games. That is a dynasty that should not be questioned in basketball. Ace of Hearts 2022 asks, how in the world could the Munich Olympics keep going on while a massacre was taking place? So this question refers to the hostage situation with the Israeli team by the Black September movement in 1972 at the Munich Olympic Games. There was a pause in competition, but IOC President Avery Brundage, a businessman from Chicago with, I would say, interesting political views, issued his famous statement of the games must go on, and thus the games did. Vera Enjoyer asks, the USA is one of the most prolific nations in the Olympics. What factors have led to this dominance? Well, the United States benefits from a lot of different weather systems and terrains, so that makes different kinds of sports part of the menu in the United States. It is a sports-crazed country with a lot of well-endowed professional leagues. And we also have this thing called the NCAA. So intercollegiate sport in the United States, which brings a lot of athletes from around the world to play competitively, is a massive training ground for future Olympians. James Giles asks, I wonder how much Olympians of today would beat the ancient Greek Olympians by. They'd beat them by a lot. Nutrition, training, focus, actual dedicated athlete as a career, there's no match. Ellen De Silva wants to know, serious question, okay, thank you. Does the Olympic torch go through every country or just the country of the Olympics? How does it travel over oceans? So the Olympic torch used to try to go to as many countries as possible. And very recently, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, changed that because the torch relay route, which used to be a space where people came out and cheered and the torch ran by and you took a selfie and that was you with the torch, became a site for protests. So they now try to limit the torch relay route between Greece and the host country. FL Web Pro asks, did China clear chronic smog for the 2008 Olympics using cloud seeding to produce heavy rain? There was blue sky in 2008 for the Beijing Olympics, and it was primarily because they shut down their industrial manufacturing segment. So there were no factories actually in operation leading up to those games and during those games, and that gave Beijing blue skies. A Reddit user wants to know, has someone ever died due to an accident while doing a sporting event? And the answer to that, sadly, is yes. Most recently in 2010 in Vancouver, on a practice run on the luge track, a Georgian luger crashed and unfortunately lost his life. A Reddit user wants to know, who would you crown as the greatest track and field athlete of all time? This is another really tough one. You have folks like Allison Felix, who have just accumulated a pile of medals. You have someone like Waimea Tyus, who in 64 and 68 defended a sprinting title, the first person to ever do that. You have people who do 100 and 200 doubles, 200 and 400 doubles. Al Order wins discus again 4 times in a row. So over the course of 16 years, Al Order wins gold in discus. Usain Bolt setting records that were just untouchable for so long. Track and field is such an enormous sport. It depends what event you want to look at and what you consider to be the merit for the greatest. T. Alkazin wants to know, how are we still breaking world records in Olympic sports? In some events, all top 3 broke the world record. I think athletes got better at doping or they're making racing distances shorter. Well, let's hope neither of those things are true. We look at sport now as a science. The technology of sport, from nutrition to training practices to equipment, mean that records will continue to be broken. The idea that figure skaters, for example, are throwing quadruple jumps was absolutely unimaginable not that long ago. Naheem says, reading up on the Black Power salute in 1968. How did I not know about this before? 1968 Olympic Black Power protest, sprinters Tommie Smith and John Carlos, American medalists, gold and bronze, record-breaking. Tommie Smith was the first human to run a 200 meters in a sub-20 race, and they took their moment in the spotlight to make a stance connected to the civil rights movement. And you should know it because it should be taught and it should be talked about. There's a lot of myths about what happened to Tommie and John post-Olympics. They did lose their Olympic credentials and they had to go home. They did keep their medals, but there were terrible consequences that they faced, backlash that they faced, people who really felt that they had ruined sport. Guy Fawkes News asks, does hosting the Olympics actually pay off? The short answer is no. It is wildly expensive and economically draining to host an Olympic Games, particularly recently, where security alone is something that can just bloat the budget beyond anything that a city can handle. It was designed to build facilities, create infrastructure, and if we look back historically, that is true. So for example, in 1968, Mexico City, telecom improvements had to be made to that region in order for the Olympics to be hosted there. It was the first time that an American network, for example, had hosted a wide broadcast. ABC Sports did 44 hours of coverage of Mexico City, and that's our first really large-scale broadcast of a Games. That said, today, the cost is draining. So if we look at our next Olympics, Cortina Milan, you see the Italians trying to reuse as much as possible from when Cortina hosted the Olympics in 1956. So today, it's much more about sustainability and reusing facilities rather than build, build, build. Crafty Mare wants to know, was there cheating in ancient sports competitions? Of course, there's always been cheating. We've never not cheated at stuff as humans. We had sabotage in the ancient games, there was bribery in the ancient games, probably tripping, I don't know, I'm speculating, but yes, the Greeks absolutely cheated in the ancient games. Storm and Pumpkin asks, watching the Olympics, what countries have rivalries? All I know is USA rivals, and that's okay because the USA has a lot of them. USA, Australia swimming, USA, Canada hockey is certainly, women and men, one of the biggest. There's a lot of rivalries in baseball, China, Japan, and Cuba, absolutely. And then we sort of have the historic rivalries where if you follow the political lines of the world at any given moment, the entirety of the Cold War, so the Soviet Union and the United States, Eastern Europe and the United States, but you also see things like Japan and Korea, where North Korea fits into the Olympic world, is constantly creating sort of us and them binaries. Jamaica versus everybody in terms of track and field, you just gotta look for them. Classic Poodle asks, have Olympics ever been canceled before? Didn't the US skip them one year? Yes, World War I and World War II meant that Olympic Games were canceled, too, for World War II. Then we actually have a postponement if we think not that long ago, Tokyo 2020 became Tokyo 2021, even though we still called it Tokyo 2020 because no one wanted to change the merch. And there is one games that the United States boycotted, 1980 Moscow, the ultimate Cold War move. Flash forward 4 years to Los Angeles. Eastern Europe returned the favor by boycotting on their part. Board Bouncer wants to know, did Russia cheat at the Olympics? The most simple answer to that is yes. Russia was banned from the Olympics by WADA, the World Doping Agency, because of systemic institutionalized doping and an enormous cover-up scheme so that that doping was not detected. Russian athletes can still compete in the Olympics, but they have to compete as neutrals. That ban was then extended after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Russia's fate as an Olympic entity remains kind of blurry. Key Opinion 1700 wants to know, many people say most Olympians are doping, but how do they pass the tests then? The whole system of doping is that your testing protocol needs to be one step ahead of the doping protocol, and quite often that is not the case. So the pattern of doping, when athletes do and don't engage, how they may or may not avoid out of competition testing. In terms of what Russia did, they created an entire system of neutralizing the tests, switching them out that was undetectable until there was a whistleblower. So basically, avoiding doping tests needs to be one step ahead of actual doping, and that's how you get away with it. A Quora user asks, can an Olympic athlete refuse a medal? Technically, no. You're not supposed to, because it's considered by the IOC to be an insult against the games. And some athletes have been banned or censured for behaving inappropriately with a medal, throwing down a medal. But really, the most significant moment in which athletes refused a medal is 1972. The US men's basketball team refused to accept the silver medal. And this is one of the most controversial moments in Olympic history. It was the Soviet Union versus the United States. America invented basketball. This was never supposed to be something that they could lose. During that basketball game, the refs kept adding 3 seconds back onto the clock until the Soviets won. The United States refused to accept the silver, and those medals remain in a vault in Switzerland. A Reddit user wants to know, what happened to the full body suits in the Olympics? So I'm assuming that this question is asking about swimmers and the so-called Speedo shark skin suit. And that was an incredible technology that took away drag, which is the swimmer's body going through the water, and added buoyancy. And after pretty much every record was broken by anyone wearing one, FINA, which is the international federation that supervises swimming and regulates swimming, said no more, and they were banned. A Quora user asks, how are the Olympics experienced before the invention of television? We almost can't think about watching the Olympics without thinking about the Olympic broadcast. There's more Olympic broadcast hours in a day than there are hours in a day. But we really didn't see those full-scale broadcasts until the late 50s and 1960s. Cortina, the Winter Games in 1956, was the actual first broadcast of a games. There were 15-minute snippets from Tokyo in '64, but 1968, ABC Sports really creates the blueprint for a massive platform of Olympic programming. And it was still only 44 hours, but then 44 hours was a massive undertaking by a network. Before that, it was old-fashioned newspaper, radio, and the radio broadcasts were exciting, and people huddled around the radio just as they did for any other sports broadcast. Or you could hop on a plane or a boat and actually go and be a spectator. All right, that's all of the questions for today. Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something.